413 of them. And it was in the transcribing and the interpreting and the administration and the disciplining and all that went through that law that the Jewish people literally did gain their identity as a nation, as a race, as a religion, as a people, even as individuals. And every bit of it was typified, summarized, illustrated first in that little tabernacle and later the temples that would be built. And there is the connecting link between the Jews of today and the temples of old. They still see their identity as wrapped up in those ancient temples. The tabernacle would serve that purpose for about 450 years. It was near the end of King David's reign when it was in David's heart to build a house for God. God spoke to David through the prophet and told him, "Thank you, David, I appreciate what you want to do, and I will build my house. But when I do," God said, "it's going to be a house of prayer." And that means it must be built by a man of peace. You see, out of necessity, David had been a warrior king. He had fought wars and shed blood. But God told him that his son Solomon would have a reign of peace and would be the one to build that temple. David gathered all the necessary materials, even put aside the money. So when Solomon became king, it took him 7 years to build the first of the temples, Solomon's temple. And what a structure it was. Everything in it, it seems, made of gold, covered in gold. Scholars have estimated there were over $8 million worth of gold just in the front steps alone. We cannot imagine the splendor of that temple. It stood for almost 400 years, until 586 BC, when the Babylonians came, destroyed Solomon's temple, the city of Jerusalem, and took the Jews into the Babylonian captivity. 70 years later, a Jewish remnant returned to the land of Judea, about 42,000 Jews, and they rebuilt a second temple, which they called Zerubbabel's temple. Zerubbabel was the governor of the returning Jewish exiles, and it was the custom of that day to name such a structure or building after their leader. And so, Zerubbabel's temple. Now, it was inferior to Solomon's. They even used some of the burnt and destroyed ruins of Solomon's temple to rebuild that second one. Nevertheless, it would, inferior as it was, serve the people for the next 500 years. 500 years. Down to the days of a king whose name we're familiar with, Herod. Herod the Great, the king when Jesus was born. Herod was, among other things, a brilliant architect. He was a master builder, and he embarked on an extremely ambitious building project on the Temple Mount that would eventually take 82 years to complete, long after Herod had died. But when it was finished, there sat on those 36 acres of land that make up the Temple Mount today a set of buildings and structures that were the absolute envy of the architectural world. And the crown jewel of it all was that temple. Herod had built up over and around the existing structure a magnificent temple 180 feet high, made of the finest white polished marble, much of it covered in gold layering. He was going to layer the entire exterior in gold. The Jews asked him to stop. They found that the marble was of such intensely fine quality that as the sun passed overhead each day, it reflected hues and colors that were more beautiful than the gold itself. A secular writer of the day had written that if you've never seen the temple at Jerusalem, you have never seen a beautiful building. The Jews believed it was indestructible. Fathers taught their sons. They would bring them to the mount and tell them, heaven and earth may pass away, but that temple will stand forever. But in 70 AD, the Romans came under their brilliant general, Titus. Titus was the general. His father was the emperor Vespasian. And Vespasian had told his son Titus to destroy every building, house, structure in Jerusalem, to level the entire city to the ground. But when Titus saw that temple, he was so overwhelmed and impressed with its beauty, he was going to spare it, even at the displeasure of his father, the emperor. But Titus wanted to see that temple up close, inside and out. The Jews said absolutely not. Wrong thing to tell the Roman legion. A battle ensued. The Jews put up a valiant effort, but eventually the Romans gained access, and threw lit torches into the windows of the temple, catching the tapestries and cedar beams on fire. The heat from those flames caused the gold layering to melt and run between the cracks and crevices of the stone. When cooled, the soldiers began to dismantle the structure one stone at a time, scraping out the gold as they went. When they did that, they literally fulfilled Jesus' prophecy that the day would come when not one stone would be left standing upon another. And for the Roman soldiers' love of gold, not one stone left standing upon another. Prophecy fulfilled. With the loss of their temple, the Jews also lost their priesthood and their sacrificial system. And just like coming out of Egypt, once again, they found themselves in a devastated condition. And just when they thought it could not get any worse, Murphy's Law took over. Kind of reminds me of when I was in the Marine Corps. They used to tell us, smile. Things could get worse, so we smiled. Sure enough, things got worse. Kind of happened that way for the Jews because the Romans began to disperse them throughout the empire. They did not want the Jews to gather in one location in large numbers and rebel against Rome again. The Jewish leaders saw their whole way of life disappearing before their very eyes. So they went to the Romans with a request. Allow us, they said, to open a yeshiva. A yeshiva is simply a school of learning. All we want to do there, they said, is to leave a written record that our children and grandchildren do not lose the heritage, the tradition of their forefathers. The Romans agreed. The Jews opened their yeshiva in a city called Javnia, over near the Mediterranean coast. The finest scholars in Israel met together, and the first question they attempted to answer was this. For generation after generation, they said, we have depended upon the temple, the sacrifices, the priesthood, to have the favor of God, the forgiveness of sins, hope of eternity. Now, all that is gone. What do we do now to have the favor of God? A legitimate question. And I know how they should have answered it. They should have gone back to their Bible, to the Tanakh, the Old Testament, the only Bible they had. They should have looked at the many messianic prophecies and recognized that each and every one was completely fulfilled in Jesus of Nazareth. They should have said the one whom our fathers rejected, the one whom they hung upon the cross. Truly, he was the Messiah. We must prepare our hearts and the hearts of our people to receive him as such. That, you see, is why God destroyed that magnificent temple, took away their priests and sacrifices. Oh, how God was trying to turn their heart, their mind, their eyes away from what the book of Hebrews says was never intended to be anything more than a shadow, a type, an illustration. And God was trying to turn them to the reality, the substance, the Messiah, to Jesus himself.